Hello, everyone. Good morning to you, those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you a bit further east. My name is David Danker from the Customer Success Team from Zencity, and welcome to our Zencity Local Government webinar series. Today, we're going to talk a bit about how cities are balancing some of the serious challenges and dilemmas that they are facing today as they reopen their economies and their societies. We know that city leaders are on the front lines of meeting some of the most serious challenges in their communities. And really these truly extraordinary times. And so we really want to thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to learn and to share today. We're really grateful for this opportunity to bring leaders together. And most of all, I want to thank our speakers today, Dave Zabell, the City Manager of Pasco, Washington, and from the City of Chula Vista, City Manager Gary Halbert, and Dennis Gakunga, the city's Chief Sustainability Officer. So thank you all for joining us today. You can still hear me, right? Everyone can hear me? Excellent. That's most important. So some other technical notes. We really encourage everyone joining us today to ask questions or share perhaps a very short anecdote. And to do so, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and also the chat feature as well. And we'll incorporate that into our discussion today. So I'm going to share my screen here. Oh, Jonathan, can you please enable the screen sharing? So great, so a brief overview. So after a quick introduction, we're going to hear from the cities of Chula Vista and also from Pasco, Washington, and then have some time for a live Q&A. So first, just a brief note about Zencity. Zencity is a tool powered by artificial intelligence that's used to help local governments make data-driven decisions. We work now with over 130 cities and counties across the world, helping them listen to their voices of their over 30 million residents. We know that local government is hard to manage, and it's particularly important that local governments are hearing from a wide range of voices and concerns from across their communities, both those voices that are perhaps a bit more vocal and those that are a bit less vocal. And we're here to help cities gather that information. A lot of that information today is gathered by legacy tools, but also there's lots of information, lots of dialogue happening out there organically. So we're here to help you get that information which is already out there. Every day, Zencity collects millions of data points from over thousands of sources, whether they be about discussions, whether they be about social distancing and face covering policies, residents' opinions about opening public facilities such as parks and schools, or managing protests and public safety. So we're here to help cities make some sense of what's going on and the conversation about them, to quantify and aggregate data, and help them answer some of the big questions that they're facing today. So some of those questions that we're hearing now from our communities across the United States about reopening are the following. Concerns about how do we balance our budget as we enter the new normal? What policies should we use to manage both health and economic concerns? How should we best navigate through a charged political atmosphere? And of course, are we really meeting our residents' needs? And so with that, I'd like to turn over to Gary Halbert, City Manager of Chula Vista, to share with us a few words about the community in Chula Vista and how you're using communication to meet some of these key challenges.
Thank you, David. So Chula Vista is the photo that you just saw was actually the city of San Diego. Chula Vista is off to the right of that picture. We're about 7 miles south of downtown San Diego. We're located on the San Diego Bay. We have a population of around 275,000. For us, when we actually started this conversation with David, it was in the middle of the COVID crisis, and we're focusing in on how we're dealing with that. And then now we have with all of the public protests that we have yet another issue that we're dealing with now. But so I'm going to touch on both of those, and they're a bit different. When you think of the COVID crisis in Chula Vista, we're 7 miles south of downtown San Diego and 7 miles north of the Mexican border. And if you may have seen in the news recently that Tijuana in particular is having a very difficult time with COVID. They don't have the public health system to support them, and their hospitals are overwhelmed. as a result, we've seen a lot of expatriates that live down in Tijuana, but are American citizens that have gotten ill and come up across the border to get health care. As a result, and because the border is so fluid, we're the busiest border crossing in the world. The South Bay area of San Diego County has been particularly hard hit. So, but when you think about COVID and how do you deal with this crisis, and there's all this confusion out there at the federal, the state, the county level, and people, you really need to have a strong message going to your community as to what exactly is expected of them. And to that end, we have literally not written a citation for anyone at this point. We have had to do a cease and desist order for one business, but it's about how do you get your citizens and your businesses to voluntarily cooperate. And quite frankly, we're beginning to see positive data coming from the COVID crisis. One of the things that we need to know is, as we're messaging to our community, are they hearing what we're saying, number one, and number two, what kind of messaging to the community will result in that voluntary compliance? Because the reality is that is what all of us cities are relying on, is the voluntary compliance of our citizens and of our businesses. And to that end, and I think you even have some of this information. Yeah, what we've found from some of the data we've gotten from Zencity is that messages that are less bureaucratic, they're less, here's your restrictions on what you need to do today, because it changes so often. But more things that are sent out in a friendly and specific manner, storytelling manner, strikes better with the community. So if we have, for example, as we open up new restaurants, because we're now into that phase, as we open restaurants, we send out a question, what restaurant are you thinking of going to first? And that resonates better with the community than going into the details of what restaurants have to do to comply with the code. We can work one-on-one with those restaurants, and in fact we're doing that. We're requiring that all businesses, in essence, do a no fee permit with us, so that we know what they're going to be doing, and we can go out and in the future inspect their businesses. So then, shifting gears to talk about the ongoing public protests, and Dennis actually lives in a city that was particularly hard hit, so it'll be interesting to hear what he may have to say about this as well. But Chula Vista we have not had public protests, but we've been prepared. We've had, some amount of graffiti and stuff. But one of the things we want to be sure we're doing when we communicate with our community, we want to provide reassurance. We want to let them know that we support peaceful public protests if there are ones that occur. But we want to be sure that we're not messaging in a way that creates additional fear or anger. And by way of example of one that happened last week, a police officer notified a business in our downtown that they ought to think about moving their valuables away from the front windows of the stores. Next thing we know, everybody's boarding up their stores, and we don't have any indication of protests or potential rioting going on at this point. So it's really important that we know, how are people responding to the messages that we're putting out there.
So thank you for that, Gary. And importantly, the importance of getting through some of the confusion and using really quick communications to communicate with the public, to avoid that and to avoid kind of other things down the line. And so perhaps also turn to Dennis to talk about how your city is thinking about kind of coming out of this crisis a bit stronger and looking into the future.
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, David. First, it's glad to see that everyone is doing well. We hope folks continue to stay safe and healthy as we go through these, really difficult times across the country. So you touched on something that's really central with regards to the crisis that we're facing, both with regards to COVID, as well as the ongoing protests and public discourse that we're having. And that is the importance of ensuring that communities, have the tools and that they're positioned, one, to be able to receive information, whether it's public safety information from the city, but as also to allow cities to receive those feedback loops from our communities. So, based on recent data that's available, we found that about 4.7% of Chula Vista residents don't have access to digital devices that are working or that are in a condition that would allow them to be able to participate and engage in an effective manner. And also tied to that is 11% of our residents don't have broadband internet access. So even if based on those numbers, we're not, as hard hit with regards to digital divide as other places in the country, it's still a significant population within Chula Vista that is essentially facing the barriers with regards to being able to engage. One of the things that COVID has done, is really moved a lot of our day-to-day, pretty much essentially all our day-to-day online. And if you don't have access to, quality and affordable internet access, or devices, that's, computers and tablets and smartphones, as well as the tech savvy and the IT literary skills to be able to use them, well, you're at a disadvantage, every aspect of it. We're doing this call and I'm sitting in my living room. My kids are upstairs going to school. On Sunday, we just had online services. So you think about everything moving online. You talk, my wife is a physician and she's doing certain elements of medical care with her patients online. So when you use those examples, you begin to see how absolutely important it is to have digital equity. And so what the city is doing is being proactive. So we've developed this digital equity plan. It's the first of its type in the county. And that plan, as you can see from this slide, has three main goals. And mainly it's around trying to identify who is impacted by the digital divide. And when I say digital divide, we're talking about ensuring that whoever you are, regardless of your age, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your income, regardless of your status with whether you're a student, that you have equal access to affordable and quality internet, as well as the devices and the liberty skills to participate in our economy. So this is intended to address that. The main thing is the first goal being around being data-driven, understanding the scope of what that digital divide looks like. One of the things that COVID has shown us is that impacts don't stop at the boundary of your city. Gary just talked about the inflow of the constant flow of the traffic from the border, or even in our county, or even within our country. So we have to be able to identify what this digital divide and what its impacts look like from a regional lens. And with that information, look to see how you can devise and create formal avenues to begin to address that from a regional standpoint. The second goal is around institutionalizing digital equity and inclusion, essentially making digital equity be a part of the fabric of how the city does business, whether it's how we're looking at updating various policies and programs and initiatives within the city, as well as trying to see what we have in-house, what kind of existing resources, existing programs can we leverage and retool and essentially use as a springboard to advance our initiatives around digital equity. And that also ties in with trying to expand and evaluate if those programs that we've been offering are working. And the third thing, which is really important, especially in this age of COVID, as well as what we're currently facing right now with the public protests, is looking for partnerships. Gary just talked about this, the city of La Mesa, which is where I live. And the city was the hardest hit, or one of the hardest hit cities, certainly the hardest hit in the county. Over the weekend, we saw 2 bank buildings burned to the ground. We saw multiple businesses and store locations vandalized. And there's a huge distrust that is existing right now. And it's elevated the importance of being able to establish partnerships, one, to reestablish trust, two, to ensure that there's transparency. And the key drivers of having transparency is your ability to quickly reach communities and provide information and answer questions and, and receive input. So the ability to look for partnerships in order to ensure that we have in place opportunities and the ability to communicate with our residents is hugely important. And then with this goal also is the whole concept of how do you pay for things? As city governments, we're really good at coming up with great ideas that, are exciting and get us all motivated. But that all changes when you start talking about, well, how are you going to pay for it? So this goal is intended to see or to lay out, a roadmap for us to be able to start looking to find funding opportunities through partnerships that may exist in our community.
So Dennis, let me ask you, because I imagine that there are many other communities who, especially as more and more residents are speaking online and turning to online forums to share information and to look for information from the city, what are some of the kind of key things that surprised you in this process of building this initiative? And kind of one of your kind of top 2 tips, for cities who want to do something similar?
Well, the main thing is that you have to make sure that you have all the stakeholders around the table. So one of the things that we did, and I would like to mention, this effort took over a year. So when we started this, we started in May of last year. And when we started this, if someone had told us that in a year from our start date, that 97% of all American households would be under stay-at-home orders, or over 55 million students from around the country would be at home impacted by school closures, no one would have believed it. It would have been unimaginable. We knew it was important that digital equity become a priority within the city, but we had no idea how absolutely critical it would become in just a year. So our process involved multiple workshops. We first had a community workshop where we invited key advocacy groups because they're closest to the communities that are impacted. In this effort, we were able to identify the key groups that are impacted. So we had the advocacy groups. We also had our regional cities participate in this, as well as city leadership. So that was first. But then the second thing is we had a subsequent workshop whereby we took what we thought we heard and what we thought we understood to be important components of a digital equity and engaged in a public workshop, essentially making sure that we're ground truthing what we think is important with the community. And that is hugely important because you want to put out something that is relevant and that addresses what you're trying to accomplish. So that would be my recommendation.
We have one question from the audience about that. It's asking which department is responsible for this program. So maybe Dennis, share a bit more about your department and the different smart city initiatives that you oversee. And also, how do you measure success with this initiative? When a year from now, when you say, hey, we did this and this and this, to know that we're on the right track?
That's a great question. So our city manager, Gary, who will be retiring in a few weeks, he reorganized our department so that the Office of Sustainability is under the Economic Development Department and is also responsible for helping to coordinate innovation. So within the city of Chula Vista, when we're talking about or looking at innovation, citywide innovation projects, we're also by default talking about economic development. So my department, is the Office of Sustainability, is essentially taking the charge. However, as I mentioned, the development of this plan, as well as the implementation of this plan, will be cross-departmental. So we do have a Smart Cities Working Group, which consists of our city manager, assistant city manager, deputy city managers, department heads, as well as police and fire, who are charged with the implementation of our Smart Cities efforts. And they also will be responsible for the implementation of this plan. Now, with regards to key performance indicators, within the plan itself, one of the goals talks about, tries to outline the importance of creating key performance indicators. So we looked at case studies, we did research, and we listed a host of what we think are relevant key performance indicators that we should be looking at. And we've also reached out to some partners. One example is the school districts, the elementary school district, as they're gathering metrics around needy families and how they're impacted by lack of devices across the city. We'll be coordinating with partners such as the school districts to look for various metrics that we could track to see what kind of impact we're having with our plan.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis and Gary. And to remind you that please, if you have any questions, just share them in the chat or in the Q&A bubble below. So thank you. So we'll turn now to Pasco, Washington, to Dave Zabell, the city manager, to share a bit about tell us a little bit about your community. What is it? What is Pasco? And talk specifically about how you're helping navigate some of the really difficult challenges within the city today.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, or yeah, good morning, I guess still. Pasco is part of what's called the Tri-Cities area of Washington State, and which means we're located border to border with Kennewick, Washington, and Richland, Washington. And so our population is about 77,000, but our metro area is about 300. Right around 300,000, and encompasses two different counties, Franklin and Benton County. So we got two sets of county commissioners to deal with, and all of this as well. And so we're located in south central Washington, right where the Columbia and the Snake River come together. So it's a great spot from a natural beauty standpoint, and good transportation links and railroads, and as well as the Hanford Nuclear Reservation and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, which employ literally tens of thousands of people. About $2 billion worth of federal money comes into our community on an annual basis. So we have also a very high level of agricultural production here, not just the growing of crops and harvesting, but also the processing, packaging, and distribution, those type of things. So we have a pretty broad array of citizens from an economic standpoint, and an educational standpoint. So it's an interesting community to work in, and the cities definitely impact one another. And so we try to work really closely with the other two cities in particular, and then some of the smaller cities that ring the metro area as well. So have great relationships and with Marie Mosley from Kennewick, city manager there, and Cindy Rentz from City of Richland. So we try to approach the whole thing as a team. So also we're in Washington State, and Washington State, as many of it were, that's at least on the West Coast, that's where COVID kind of broke out. And our state government took it very seriously, and well, they did, considering the early numbers we had, and we've done a really, I think, good job as a state in reining it in. We didn't wind up like some of the other states. Still an unfortunate death toll, but not nearly what it would have been if we hadn't taken some early actions. And some of those early actions, and you can see on the first slide, have to do with social distancing. And in Washington State, Open Public Meetings Act restrictions were put in place to tighten that up. For instance, no public is allowed to our city council meetings, and our city council is not allowed to our city council meetings. All that could be at our city council meetings basically we can have a person to comply with the governor's order, and I'll say the governor is not out, arresting people or anything, but we're trying to set a good example, and that's part of, we're ambassadors out there, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But council wants to set a good example too, and when you can see their living rooms in the background, that tells folks they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But it does put a challenge on getting business done when you have to have 6 of your council members. Only the chair really should be at the council chambers, myself, and then 2 tech staff that are helping us operate the video equipment to kind of make the event happen. Public's allowed to view in. They can either view in as purely a viewer, or they can log in as a participant. And we have yet to have anyone. Actually, I'll take that back. We've only had one person out of, I think, 10 weeks we've had meetings log in as a participant and try to give public testimony on an issue. And because of those difficulties, the other part of the governor's order has been that the only topics that we can take on are pretty much non-controversial. He described them as routine, like paying the bills or approving minutes or things like that, or necessary, payroll, paying contractor payment amounts and claims and so forth. So our business is really stacking up, and including even the ability to have an executive session. And a city even our size has a lot of that business to do. So like I say, you see the screenshot of our council members, and that a lot of them have their mouths open, so they're actively participating in the meetings. One of the things I think we've noticed is that they are spending a lot more time on issues than they normally would, because they're really feeling distance from the day-to-day, or at least weekly, their participation in helping operate the city, and their role as policymakers, and being on site, and also we're not able to take a lot of the issues to the meatier issues that we normally would too. And so there's a lot of frustration, and they'll spend a lot of time on some issues that normally they'd spend 5 or 10 minutes on. One of the things they struggle with is there is a bit of a technical divide in our community. We heard about it, from the previous speaker, Dennis, and we've done a lot. School district primarily, because of the remote school, had worked very closely with PUD, and really helped that issue along with some initiatives to bring 5G in a lot of neighborhoods that were really very much underserved, so the kids there could connect to and get their studies done. And so now we're struggling with the divide, and I don't mean a divide from necessarily a equipment standpoint. It's a generational standpoint of, how do I log in to participate in a city council meeting? And it gets really complicated for some people that aren't used to doing that. And so that's something that's been difficult for our council members. I will say somehow it's a little easier for those folks to log in on Facebook. And so they're getting a lot of input that way that they're trying to then try to incorporate into our meetings, and that's creating its own set of issues. But
you shared that there's a lot of kind of unprecedented decisions that are about to be made with council, with some of the budget issues and some of the new funding opportunities that are available from the state and from the federal government. And with the social distancing in place, what are you doing to help kind of educate council that they make the most informed decision possible moving forward?
So we are, one of the things we're doing is we're doing outreach through our Facebook. We're doing a lot more outreach with the business community as to what they need, because we do have some CARES money coming available. Obviously, some of that we're going to need to mitigate some of the impacts, more impacts of the mitigation than COVID itself, but some of the impacts of COVID, the pandemic, and the mitigation measures in place. And we're probably going to have a significant amount, probably about 50% of our CARES Act money that our council is very intent on trying to get out to the small business community. We have a lot of small businesses in the city, and they're wrestling with some pretty weighty stuff. I mean, yeah, we're used to it. We're a direct recipient of CBDG monies, and so we do have those programs in place, and but the thing is that there's already eligibility, and there's already reporting, and there's already that mechanism, that infrastructure to properly distribute those funds. And council does have a bit of a role in that they have a list that they approve on an annual basis. And so this is something we're making up as we go along, and we're trying to help local businesses. Our CBDG money, say, is $600,000-700,000 a year. We have 2.3 million potentially to distribute, and we're looking at grants as low as $10,000 or $15,000, $20,000. And so we don't have the infrastructure to have 100 recipients.
Yeah.
And track that money for so trying to get council educated on that piece, and educate the public so that the council can, it is a challenge, and a lot of emails, a lot of phone conversations. I think that's one of the great things about the situation we're in is people are using their phone a lot more to talk on than they have in the past several years. We've kind of got used to texts and emails, and the phone's working out to be a pretty good tool that we're rediscovering.
So along those lines, we have a question also from the audience about, you mentioned the phone, but also social media. And how are you incorporating social media with other forms of input to help make these decisions and listen to the community?
Well, I mean, social media, is because we're basically a little less than a third of the metropolitan population. Our social media, it doesn't say, John Smith from Kennewick. It just says John Smith, right? And so one of the tools we are using, and I don't necessarily mean to put this out as a plug for you guys, and I don't have a Zencity mug or anything to drink my coffee out of, but our dashboard has been really helpful in trying to balance some of that out. What the council members are hearing on social media. We have one council member, for instance, been involved very much, her and her husband, in the Flatten the Curve effort here locally, and so tons and tons of followers, and so she's getting a lot of traffic, and we have to balance that out to what's really coming that's pertaining to Pasco itself, because our small businesses here very much different than many in the metropolitan area. We have a very high Hispanic population here, and a ton of small businesses, and they operate. Their big days are Saturday and Sunday, and a lot of times, our Main Street operators don't even open on the weekend because they make all their money on the weekdays. Except maybe late into the evening. I mean, the hours are different than what we see as a traditional business.
Yeah, and so you spoke also, we spoke a few days ago about the role of the city as a role model. And so maybe you can share a little bit about, how your workers are being a role model, and also not just the city council. Share about your experience, with that. With
yeah, sure. And we, we're working through that. As I mentioned before, on Open Public Meetings Act, we're maybe a little bit different than a lot of the cities that might be listening in Washington State. Same with our personal protective equipment and things like that. The governor has put in more stringent standards than what we see out of CDC. So some of this may sound a little different to some of you, but we kind of feel like we're very visible out there, and we have an opportunity to set the example. And so right away we got on the PPE stuff, even with you can see the picture with our public works crew out there, and so we're out in the community wearing our masks when we can. You're doing the social distancing. One person to a unit, and we're doing things different than what we were just 6-10 weeks ago. And so I think we're getting some good feedback. I'll mention though that we did get called out by the local health officer on a regional call last week, because we have a very highly followed police book page, And as a matter of fact, I think it's like 65,000 followers or so. So it's a pretty good number out there. And we had a few pictures on there with police officers and members of the public without their masks on in the police station. And our health officer was quick to call us out in front of everybody on that. And we were able to talk to the chief but so there's an example of people are watching, I guess, and that was on social media. And so a lot of folks saw that. And we did get some feedback about where's your masks. And so it's important that we're out doing that. Fires probably impacted most, because we have an ambulance utility that works, that our firefighters are also paramedics. So they certainly are wearing their gear all the time, even in the station. And police have some other issues associated with peripheral vision and being able to see, in all cases, and having a good field of vision. So they're a little bit different to wrangle, and we have a union that's trying to do a balanced look at safety as well. So.
Of course. Yeah. So thank you so much. So we have a question from the audience about funding and about looking forward to economic development, and I think we'll ask for both communities and start with Gary. Is that with respect to some of the CDBG money and some other monies coming in from outside the community, maybe from the state or the federal government, and distributing it to businesses, are any of the local banks or nonprofits assisting in that effort? Who are your partners in kind of getting the money out and hopefully the most efficient way possible?
So we're doing a partnership with the city of San Diego using it was about a $6 million bank where they were loans, and we were using San Diego Foundation, which is a nonprofit, to help in the distribution of that. We're going to be using some of our CDBG allocation to do additional dollars for small businesses. But in that case, we're looking at a situation where small businesses already have enough on their hands to get open. And so we don't want to do loans with them. We want to just do grants. And so we'll execute those straight out of our economic development office.
And that's a regional office, or because you said it's
No. So this would be Dennis's office. So the larger big pool of monies being done regionally between the city of San Diego, city of Chula Vista, but the smaller, the CDBG pot, because it's really not that much money. We're just going to do grants right out of the our economic development office.
What kind of conditions are you putting on those grants? What are you asking from the businesses?
Just that they show the need, the demonstrated need.
And Dave, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and we're doing something similar. We're working with one of our local nonprofits to help us distribute the small business loans and the individual loans grants for rental and utility assistance. And we're using CBDG CARES dollars as well as our regular CARES dollars. We see that as an outlet for that. And then I did want to mention, I was on a webinar yesterday, our local Washington City Managers Association, and the other panelist was from City of Bothell, which I actually used to work for the City of Bothell as a public works director. But they had a really unique idea where for their small businesses, they're putting together a reopening kit, with PPE and other things that might be useful for the small business, just to maybe, I don't know that it helps them a lot financially, but it maybe takes some headaches away from them, and it allows a use of that money where it's a one-time shot. There's really not any paperwork that goes with it, and you can get those dollars out there without a lot of bureaucracy to go with it. So I thought that was a pretty clever idea. We're looking at that today. So and there may be other things that could spin off from that.
So that's important. We have another question from the audience here. What has changed most about your role over the last 2 months, and where do you think it'll change in the next 2 months? Maybe start with Gary, as 2 months you're going to be retired, and so congratulations.
No, 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Yeah, so I know that your assistant city manager is taking over, and we're looking forward to working with her as well. And so from what you've learned over the past 2 weeks, kind of what is your parting wisdom, for her and for your team?
So one of the things that hit us with COVID crisis, I mean, we needed to shift to remote working as much as possible. So, you know, much the same as Dave did with our council offices. But just in general, we've moved the vast majority of our staff that were in offices into working out of their homes. And I think one of the takeaways is, you know, with technology being where it's at today, back in the 90s, I worked in transportation demand management. We did, you know, telecommuting, and you just couldn't do it successfully. You actually can be very, very effective working remotely now. And so as we look at this and we look at the future, we see a new normal where we're not going to just shift towards everybody going back into the office. And if you think of it from a standpoint of sustainability and climate action and addressing traffic circulation issues, really, you know, having people do a lot more remote working, kind of a hybrid, maybe in the office sometimes, working from home other times. I think that across the board, and I don't think it'll just be government offices, I think you'll see a lot more remote working, some even full-time. You know, I'm sure you guys may do a lot of full-time remote working, but in, you know, a lot more of shifting towards using technology as a way to support the office. And I think it's a great thing. I've gotten a lot of positive reaction from employees. So that's my biggest takeaway, is that one of the things we've learned is there is a new normal at the end of this that I think can really help us address a lot of our sustainability issues going forward.
Yeah, and Dave, you want to share that? Because you've also talked about the challenges of being remote, especially in roles where you have to work with residents and work with many constituents.
You know, I was driving into work the other day, and I saw one of our street workers out, and I was coming back from lunch because it was about 85 degrees, and he had a mask on his face, and probably the nearest coworker was 200 feet away, and he was bending over, picking up cones, and in a pretty difficult spot. And I went back and looked at our policy that we put out, and I had not got any complaints about the mask policy, but I went to look at our policy that we put out at the onset here about 9-10 weeks ago. And it had basically said, when you're out in public, wear a mask. And so one, I was really thankful to see him wearing that mask. And two, I immediately changed that policy to say, you know, in accordance with the CDC guidelines, wear a mask, to give them a little bit of relief. You know, so I think we're going to see over the next couple months, hopefully as our numbers get better, and we move into different phases, and I know California has phases as well, and a lot of our states do. We move into different phases, and some of those things back off. That for our folks out in the field, we can kind of relax some of what we're asking them to do today. I do agree on the remote work from home and remote work situations. I think there's a lot of benefit to that. I think the two things I have concern about is we're kind of losing some of the spontaneity you have in a live face-to-face meeting. And I don't have a solution for that right now, but I think that's something I think we need to guard against, and then guard against that maybe loss of team that you might get when people are so remote and you don't have that interpersonal, those interpersonal connections that you have. You can't catch somebody right after a meeting. You have to set something else up, and not everything can be a Zoom meeting. You do want to see somebody's face. You can call them on the phone right after, but then you don't see the body language or the face. And so, you know, and I'm a person that loves my bubble, and I miss that. So I can't imagine how other people feel about it. But so I think there's a lot of good that can come of it, but just there's a lot of things to consider when going forward. And it's kind of interesting because I would have thought myself to be the last one to worry about those kind of things until I started feeling it myself. And even walking around the office in the hallway, you know, we kind of do a little semicircle around each other to try to keep our 6 feet apart. And it kind of reminds me of when my kids were teenagers and they didn't want me getting too close where I could grab them, you know, and take them to task for what, you know, ill they might have done last night. So, yeah.
David, I would like to add to that. So we've been talking about this for a number of years now within the city of Chula Vista. Basically, how do we break open the walls of City Hall and meet the community where they are versus a traditional model of having folks come to City Hall should they want to interface and engage with the city. So what you're seeing now with the need to work remotely is that as folks begin to get comfortable and begin to realize, as Gary mentioned, that you could still be very effective and that you can still have a model of, being able to work remotely. I think there's a huge opportunity once we get over this COVID crisis that we will have in place some lessons learned to be able to continue to engage with the communities in a different way.
So great. I think with that, we're going to conclude here. So I really want to thank you all again for your time, and thank you for everyone who attended the webinar today. So to Dave, Dennis, and Gary, thank you all so much again for taking your time, and to everyone. To learn more about some of their projects, I encourage you to visit their sites. I think there's some really great information. We also have our contact information for any follow-ups. Encourage you all also to learn more about some of the resources that Zencity is providing for COVID-19 response, and especially now in this time of reopening. And we look forward to having you on next webinar. For those interested, we're hosting a webinar next week regarding cities in the state of Florida. So stay tuned for more information about the registration. So thank you all again so much. And